Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to the Sheep Pen, where no goats are allowed. So today we're going to continue our series on the demonic plot. This episode is about the role the church has played in the demonic plot. Now, the role the church has played goes back before the 100-Year Plan. That the church has been infiltrated by the demonic from the very beginning. Judas. Judas, he was definitely a plant inside of Jesus' own organization. And this theme is repeated throughout the history of the church. And one needs to look no further than the corruption within the papacy itself, which has been present almost since the very beginning. The most corrupt time in the papal history, in my opinion, as a student of history, was that period between 900 and 1100 AD, where during this time, popes would be routinely murdered by their rivals. Popes that would gain power would abuse their power and authority within the church by banishing or declaring heretics any of those that opposed them. Any opposing voice, any political rivals were often banished or even killed. That if a pope decided to levy an unreasonable tax and say a whole town decided they weren't going to pay it, he would simply send an army to destroy the city. And so this clearly is not a vessel or a vehicle of true Christianity, or does it in any way bear any resemblance to the ministry of Jesus Christ. And so the church has been corrupt from its inception. Its level of corruption ebbs and flows, but ultimately you get to a point in history where the Catholic Church is so corrupt that only a massive reformation can make changes. And so then we have the Reformation of the church. And this occurs when Martin Luther nails his accusations against the church, which included all levels of corruption, on the wall of a church building in protest, one of their own priests, because he was, in fact, a Catholic priest. And the main problem then was his main complaint. There was all kinds of corruption, but they were selling indulgences. So if you knew you were going to go out of town and you wanted to have a wild weekend and you wanted to be able to drink or party or go to an orgy or any of the things that people during that late Roman Empire would engage in, then you could buy a hall pass from a priest, if the price is right. Okay, so there was financial corruption. Many popes, although they were forcing their own priests and bishops to leave their wives under forced celibacy, that happened in around 1100 AD, roughly. This is where, through papal edict, they were able to demand that all priests then become celibate, because that wasn't the case prior to that. And there were hundreds of thousands of married priests who were forced to put their wives in a nunnery and live apart from their wives and denounce their children as illegitimate. While that was going on, while that was being forced on to lower level priests and bishops, the papacy itself was rampant with popes who had many concubines, many children out of wedlock, who were very open about their sexual exploits, including one pope who was reported to have raped pilgrims that were coming to the Vatican, literally in St. Peter's Basilica. Right? So there's no argument that the Catholic Church was corrupt. There's no argument that these Protestant churches, whether they started out in righteousness or not, they ultimately all fell into some form of corruption. And then we have the great scandals of the 20th century, mostly revolving around the Catholic Church and their priests concerning child abuse within the priesthood, and also the evangelical TV preachers who many times got caught with their pants down. And so, but nonetheless, this becomes a place that is ripe for infiltration for the 100-year plan, for this anti-God, anti-American, Norman Rockwell, family, anti-family uh, movement that we're identifying as this 100-year plan to destroy our way of life. And so, with that plan in mind, infiltrating corrupt churches was easy. They did it through politics, they did it through manipulation, they did it through hypocrisy. They were able to infiltrate the highest levels of the church, from the Vatican to all of the major denominations, and place their people in key places for a purpose. So, what is the purpose of infiltrating the church besides the ancient purpose of weakening, destroying, and discrediting the church and Christians, and therefore basically defacing or defaming Christ himself through the church, right? That's always been the goal of the devil. But what do the conspiracists, the 100-year cabal of evil, what is their 100-year plan, and what are they trying to do in the church? Well, many of you know that I was a part of an organization that was evangelical, charismatic in nature, and we transitioned into Catholicism, and I was ordained a Catholic priest. This was for the purpose of a thing called oh gosh, should have had notes. It's the convergence movement. Thank you. My brain kicked in. Yes, the convergence movement, which is the concept of reuniting Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian religions into a single voice or a single organization, at least in fellowship. And they use Christ's own words, his final words at the Garden of Gethsemane, where he prays to God that his disciples love one another, and that we would be known for our love for one another, and that he prayed that we would be one as God and Christ are one. And so this was the basis, and like all good things, it sounds like a great idea. But the goal is to homogenize all Christianity. Anytime you try to do something like was done at the Council of Nicaea in roughly 300 AD, where they gathered all the bishops from around the globe by force and forced them to homogenize their ideas into one codex of beliefs, into one set of beliefs that we call the Nicene Creed and the canonized Bible, that every time you do that, you dilute the religion. You put it in a box. You remove all of the free thinkers from circulation. And so the attempt to bring us all together seems good, except the ultimate goal is to diminish the individual's right to pursue the Christian faith as they see fit. It's the desire ultimately to undo what we call religious freedom and force people to be excluded from the club or included in the club based on their agreement with the set of bylines and bylaws and rules. So the convergence movement, or the unification of the churches into fellowship, seems like a good idea, except it's not coming from the right place. Okay? It's part of this 100-year plan. Because ultimately, the beast, the Antichrist, will make the same decision that Constantine made in the Roman Empire and decide that he needs a codified one world global religion to unite people so that we can stop fighting and dividing over religion. And so through a forced homogenation or gathering together of all faiths, forcing Christians to accept Buddhists, to accept Islam, and vice versa, if you want to be part of the global religious plan. And those that won't will be persecuted. Those that won't are already being persecuted over certain hot button issues like, say, gay marriage or other things, where if you don't believe a certain way, you're going to be excommunicated from the group, exiled, or labeled an extremist. And this will continue over every topic that doesn't fall under this homogenized, idealized, codified religion that they are forming even now as I speak. That I was part of this convergence movement, and I was behind it based on the scriptural definable prayer that Christ prayed to God at the Garden of Gethsemane, that we would be united and that we would be one as his followers. And it seems like a great idea, except the only way to do that is through power. is through enforcement, is through bylines, bylaws, guidelines, and rules that may be suggestions today, but will definitely be enforced as some kind of law tomorrow. And we start to see the lines being drawn between the subservient Christians who want to be part of the club, part of the 100-year plan, part of the big end time fiasco. Those are the ones that during the last health crisis gave up their rights to congregate, gave up their rights of their First Amendment to speak and to publicly assemble and to follow their religious leanings wherever they may lead, that when they rolled over for the lockdown, when they closed their churches and kowtowed to authority, we started to see who were the few who were fighting for individual religious freedom and who were those signing on to the one world religion, the new world order, the final conspiracy. So there's always a technological edge to these episodes concerning the 100-year plan, because technology is the main tool they've used to codify, identify, categorize people, to pigeonhole you, to put you, to profile you, to put you in a category of the complacent and the compliant versus the rebellious free thinker. And the technology has allowed them to sort us, right? Based on our Facebook postings, based on our even text messages that are supposed to be private but aren't, based on our own conversations in our own home now are being recorded. You know, we spoke about watching a movie, me and a friend in the house where this smart TV was on. And we went, hey, remember that movie? It's been a long time since I saw that movie. Within 2 hours of that conversation, that movie was being offered to us on YouTube for free. So the fact of the matter is that they're even categorizing you based on the bug you've willingly put in your house with this smartphone, with the smart TV, with the technology. And they know who's going to stand up for their rights and who's going to roll over and join the club. And the technology is also being used to control and manipulate information. I'll give you an example. In the research for this video, I wanted to research corruption in the church. And since the first, 1200 years undeniably is Catholic in origin, then I typed in corruption within the Catholic Church. I also wanted to talk about the celibacy date that, around the same time where you had these, where I talked about earlier, where you had these popes that had dozens of concubines and many, many illegitimate children and were just openly sexual. They were requiring their priests and bishops to leave their wives for celibacy and send their wives away to be exiled into exile. And just looking for that information, it's been erased from the internet since the last time I looked for this information. That I had to leave YouTube and go to Google, where I was finally able to get to a Wikipedia page that hadn't been doctored yet and find out exactly what year they made that decision. Because in times past, when I typed in the history of Catholic celibacy and the priesthood, I got legit answers to my queries. This time, I got propaganda for the Catholic Church, for the Roman Catholic Church. Many of you know I'm not anti-Catholic, but I understand that all organizations have been infiltrated and are now working in tandem, in secret, in some cases openly, with these Illuminati-led political factions that are seeking to reinvent our American way. And to do that, they need the cooperation of the clergy. And they'll do this through blackmail, through corruption, through coercion, or just through intense peer pressure. And if you can get people at key positions in key organizations where the decisions are being made, you can shape the faith and the realities of millions of Christians. You can pull them to one political point of view or the other. So the clergy, although diminished in my lifetime, and although it doesn't hold the clout it once did, The clergy is still a powerful tool and is in fact part of this 100-year plan to destroy our way of life. You know, there's a lot of controversy in the Vatican, and there always has been, but most especially since the beginnings of what we might call the pedophile priest scandal and the cover-up that came from it. Ratzenberg, who was the Pope before Pope Francis, I forget his Pope name, but his real name was Ratzenberg, and he recently died, which kind of made Francis a legitimate Pope because there aren't supposed to be two living popes. That's why in the past they didn't defrock him; they murdered him, right? But you know, this is a weird time in history where we had two living popes. One was the Pope in retirement, which they made up for him because nobody had left that position except for death for over 700 years. But Ratzenberg stepped down because, as not a bishop, I mean, not a pope, but as a cardinal, he was instrumental in moving these offending priests around and keeping them from being prosecuted by helping them disappear into the vast Catholic Church and all of its holdings throughout the world so that they could avoid prosecution for the sins and crimes they committed against children that were placed in their care. We have notorious cases that permeate the Catholic Church where nuns have been abused, held in slavery, often as sex slaves, often raped, forced to have abortions performed within the Catholic Church. All of this can be found, but nowadays it's much harder to find. Do a search and see how much Catholic propaganda you get. Then do a search about evangelical or TV preachers and find out how much they're free game. YouTube prefers that you hate on your evangelical and Pentecostal preachers, and they're protecting Catholicism. That finding the true scoop on the previous sins of the Catholic Church on YouTube now is an exercise in futility. That it's literally wired in favor of the Catholics. But nonetheless, the entire church, Catholic, Protestant, and everything in between, has been compromised and is now currently engaged on some level in holding up and pushing forward these new ideas. A lot of people want to focus on sexual sin and sexual morality, but look at how simple things like petty theft and lying have become accepted in our culture. You know, when was the last time you heard a preacher talk about telling the truth at all costs, being an open book, having transparency in your life? They don't preach on it because they don't practice it. You know, our culture, and I have to blame the church because they're the keepers of the culture, have just written off one of the 10 Commandments as not important. You can lie in any circumstance. We have presidents that openly lied under oath and weren't even removed from office. Our television broadcasters will stand on their bully pulpits and tell you a bald-faced lie repeatedly, and there is no repercussions. And even when they're caught, you're lucky if all you get is a sorry, my bad. You see, by overemphasizing sexual morality and making it a huge sin, and ignoring the other sins of the world like greed, gluttony, lies, right, theft, that people are excused for that. But if a preacher gets caught in an adulterous affair, he's toast. But he can lie to your face and nobody really calls him on it. And it's because we don't really see, it's a little white lie. Every lie is a little white lie. Now it's even permissible or expected for someone to just gaslight you in our culture and just straight up tell you something that is a bald-faced lie. You know it, he knows it, and God knows it, and they'll just say it to you and you're expected to believe it. The breakdown of some of the basic moral codes which kept our society afloat is directly the blood is on the hands of the ministers who wanted to preach all day about sexual immorality while they themselves were engaging in sexual immorality and ignoring the fact that lies have become so normal that even the police do it. And then when they get caught, they rarely are held up to any more account than my bad. If you're lucky, you're going to get a sorry I got caught. But the main role the church plays in the 100-year plan was they had to take the church low. They had to bring the church down through diluting the clergy with, and quite frankly, non-believers. That there's a reason why these people in the pulpit don't keep their own laws and rules, because they don't really believe in any of it. I've told you, as a minister climbing the ladder in several organizations, I can tell you that when I got to the top, I basically found faithless people who see themselves as performing a public service, and they see it as having psychological benefits, and they'll say stuff like, if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent a God to believe in, because it makes people feel better. They see themselves as counselors, psychologists, philanthropists helping the poor, but they don't really believe in the God that you and I serve. They don't believe in the one voice. And this is not by accident. These people were put in place and promoted through corruption as part of this infiltration that started with Judas in the 12, went through the early church and the Council of Nicaea and all the corruption around that, following through with the corrupt popes, the selling of indulgences, and even when the Puritans took over, well, look what we've become, right? When we broke away from the Catholic Church, we engaged in our own hypocrisy and in our own violations of human rights, like the Salem witch trials, which one of my ancestors, a book one of my ancestors, Cotton Mather's, my 6-time great-grandfather, he wrote a book that that was the basis that the inquisitors used, the Puritan inquisitors used to try and convict people in the Salem witch trials. And after several executions, my ancestor, who literally wrote the book, him and his father, they hightailed it to Salem and put a stop to the Salem witch trials. So all of this is evidence that corruption is part of the destabilization of the Christian faith, the permission and room to move within the culture to promote things like we talked about in this previous video, witchcraft and alternate religions, and all of that's allowed to prosper when the church is weakened. But the main goal is to blur the lines between Christian and pagan, blur the lines between Catholic and Protestant, blur the lines between right and wrong, good and evil, to the point where we just agree to all get along under some form of general monotheistic belief system. It's going to set up the possibility for the beast, the Antichrist, to show his signs and wonders, to be seen as some sort of holy man, to have a bishop or a holy man of his own called the false prophet to promote his religion, and then ultimately the forced conversion of everyone. And the Catholic Church will sign on, and the major denominations will sign on, because as a part of this 100-year plan, the churches have been infiltrated. And they know who everyone is. They know through profiling, through technology, who will stand up and say something and who won't. And they have 100, what is it? What did Schumer say? They have 100 ways from Sunday to get back at you. He was talking about the deep state. But ultimately, we're talking about the deep state within the church, the deep state within the corporations, the deep state within high tech, the deep state within the police forces. Even our military has been compromised. So it's really those of us who cling to free speech, those of us who cling to the Constitution, our constitutional rights of religious freedom, to believe what we want to believe and speak how we want to speak. And those that fought back against the lockdown and refused to be silenced. Those ministers who saw jail time, many of them in Canada, for sticking up for their right to assemble during the lockdown. Those are the true believers, and there is a remnant, the elect, the few, those of us who listen for God instead of being instructed by the papacy or the head of the religious organization or even a bishop in the pulpit, but rather we listen for the voice of God, and we're free thinkers, and we're able to go in and figure out our own salvation with fear and trembling, just as Jesus commanded us to do. And so, at any rate, I hope you enjoyed this segment where we've talked about the history of corruption in the church and how the church is going to play a role in this end time drama as it unfolds. And also, I want to remind you that I'm fully viewer funded, that I don't have a large organization. I'm an army of one with an army of angels behind me, and the Holy Spirit in my heart and soul, and whispering in my ear continuously the sound of that one voice, the voice of God. And so I can't continue to do this without your help. I need your financial support. You can contribute through PayPal. I prefer to receive gift cards in my P.O. box. That's my favorite thing, because I'm not trying to get rich. I'm just trying to buy groceries around here and keep the electricity on. So any help you can to keep this ministry afloat. I keep this shovel over here to remind me that if I don't preach, I end up digging ditches, and I'm too old for that. So keep me preaching, keep the videos coming. If you received anything from this, if you benefited from this, if you learned something from this, then please contribute to this ministry and to this cause. And I'm going to leave you with this powerful prayer. May God surround you in his ring of fire and hedge of thorns of protection. May he send mighty angels of sufficient rank, authority, and number to drive the enemy from your midst. And then may he surround you and envelop you with his peace, the peace of the Holy Spirit, the peace that surpasses all understanding. We'll see you next time on The Sheep Pen.